An older generation produced the great English pianist Clifford Curzon, famous throughout the world for many years now. Alan Blyth, the critic, went to Mr. Curzon's London home and got him onto the interesting subject of Clifford Curzon's two teachers. Interesting because they were two of the greatest artists of this century.
Clifford Curzon, your teachers were both Schnabel and Wanda Landowska. How did they view each other?
Well, naturally, their views of one another, as expressed to me, would not have been unprejudiced. They each clearly resented that I'd studied with the other, as of course most teachers do. Although I must say, in my case, it was never a question of leaving one teacher for another, because I studied intermittently with them both for as long as they lived. Landowska's remark to me that Schnabel had no taste was so wide of the mark as to make me suspect that she had never even heard him. Schnabel's views on Landowska, were much more impersonal, and any adverse criticism on his part was largely motivated by his lack of sympathy for the historical approach to music, which of course included the harpsichord. He really disliked that instrument. He felt that this approach, this historical approach, created barriers, that music should be universal and transcend any question of period and place. As for Landowska's actual playing, he praised it highly, especially what he called her great maîtrise in works like the Goldberg Variations, even on the harpsichord.
Why were they, do you think, great teachers? I mean, what do you feel you learned from them?
Well, they undoubtedly were both great teachers, totally different as their approaches were. I had equally good reasons for studying with both of them. What they did have in common was that they were both aristocrats of their instrument. Although they were both deeply involved in the music itself, they always preserved a certain distance and reserve in the presentation of the music. Although they were both born Polish Jews, neither of them showed the characteristic impulsiveness and warmth so often associated with that race. They did have the typical Jewish gift of intuition without being what is called an instinctive player. In fact, it was their analytical minds which made them both such excellent teachers. And another thing they had in common was the ability to give inexhaustible attention to detail and absolutely endless patience. I doubt whether one would have learned to play the piano from either of them, in the way one would have, say, from Tobias Maté or from Leschetizky, whose Vorbereiters, or whatever they were called, prepared the groundwork of touch and technique, according to what they thought were what he thought were the master's ideas. Landowska specialized in expressive finger technique, singing articulation, which could be applied either to the harpsichord or to the piano. With her, every note came under a microscope, so to speak. Schnabel, on the other hand, expected this groundwork to have been done before the pupil came to him. He used to say something quite funny, something about you don't pay a good chef to feed a baby. His teaching was largely concerned with phrasing, with the right stressing of the syllables of the music, and the tonal balance of all the parts, in order to give the music its full meaning. And to, of course, with the physical means by which these things could be achieved. All of that, of course, is also teaching of technique on its highest level. With Schnabel, every phrase of every piece seemed to demand its own technique, as opposed to the mere keyboard facility, which could be learnt and then applied to anything on the piano. Both of them had their pianos aligned whilst illustrating.
It's fascinating, yeah.
So that one could see exactly what they were doing. And the expressive but very economical movements of their hands had a kind of almost choreographic fascination. But above all, with Schnabel, it was his insight into what lies behind and between the written notes of the greatest music that made his teaching so invaluable. And it was for this, of course, that one went to him, first and foremost.
Everything you say, Clifford, about Schnabel makes one want to know more. Could you enlarge on his great attributes as a teacher and also as an editor?
Well, first, he was concerned with more important things than the teaching of mere piano playing, just as Liszt and Busoni had been before him. Though he did insist on certain physical conditions at the piano, such as a quietly free hand and arm and even head, with special attention to the neck muscles. The hand to be very economical in its movements. Superfluous movement was noticeably absent from his own exemplary stillness at the piano. In short, the best technique was one which brought the maximum of achievement with the minimum of effort. Many of his ideas are revealed in his endlessly stimulating edition of Beethoven's sonatas, which is so heavily annotated that a whole page sometimes carries only one line of music. All the rest of it's filled in with his notes. And you find even 2 or 3 alternative fingerings over a single note. Fingerings that are seldom chosen for convenience or comfort, but largely in the interest of phrasing and dynamics. His phrasing, of course, was unique. As an example, in his departure from traditional fingering, he would even use a thumb on a single black key if an accent was needed. Another peculiarity of Schnabel's as a teacher was that he never liked to hear a work twice from a pupil. Presumably because he was not teaching him only how to play that particular piece. He was opening out a whole world of analysis, revealing depth after depth. And after that, he expected the pupil not to copy his teacher, but to build from his lesson his own interpretation, and to remain flexible and open-minded and so on.
Yes.
I remember once when I was particularly dejected about the way something was going, he said, "Cheer up, I played it like that for over 20 years." That he tended to teach mainly his own repertoire, in which he felt he had most to give, didn't mean that he wasn't interested in all other music. In his younger days, he played a vast range of music. He could give as fine a lesson as anyone on the Liszt Sonata, for instance, or on the Mephisto Waltz, or even on one of the Liszt concertos. And moreover, he could play them in the class with astonishing virtuosity, presumably without practice, because he never practiced that kind of music. Wouldn't this be a good moment, as a relief from so much talk, to listen to Schnabel playing one of these rather unfamiliar works?
Yes.
Let's put on his recording of that waltz by Weber, Aufforderung zum Tanz, which he made, I think he was over 60 when he made it, wasn't it, or something
yes,
like that?
yes.
Let's have a bit of that.
Clifford, it's just over 20 years now since Schnabel's death. Where do you think he stands?
Well, in answer to that, I think I can't do better than quote from an article in the main Salzburg newspaper, commenting on a recent reissue of some of Schnabel's recordings. The writer says, "How austerely simple, how well shaped, and nevertheless how alive in every smallest detail. How wonderfully phrased and committed to the deepest meaning, rather than to the letter of the music, is Schnabel's Beethoven. This is a synthesis of virtuoso piano playing and chamber music style." I think that's very good,
Yes,
virtuoso
yes.
piano playing and chamber music style, which is hardly likely ever to be repeated. One from which pianists can still learn today, and that's the point, Alan.
This is a very perceptive summary.
That's a remarkable summary, I think. Anyway, Schnabel used to say that certain kinds of playing could become as old-fashioned as certain clothes. This certainly does not apply to his playing. Perhaps because he was so totally involved with the composer's intentions. There was never any place for those personal idiosyncrasies which so unavoidably date an artist's playing. Actually, I think the appreciation of Schnabel now stands higher than ever.
Yes,
The reason perhaps being that what we always hear on his records is so near to a live concert hall performance and not at all like those pieced together bits of tape which can never be a substitute for the real thing, however perfect they eventually turn out to be, as it's without unity or continuity.
I think we're so often guided along the next bit of our path by suddenly hearing a great performer of some kind. And it was hearing Schnabel play the A major posthumous sonata, and what else? Oh, and all the moments musicaux. I knew at 17 that I had never heard anything remotely like that before. And so my life was directed towards getting enough money and going to Berlin. So I threw up everything and went to Berlin and lived there for 2 years. So this brought me to Schubert, but curiously enough, the D major sonata, the one I've just played, it wasn't Schnabel that brought me to that work at all. I happened to hear it the very first week I was in Berlin as a student. I went to hear Ellie Nye, who was then the great German woman pianist, and she played it. I thought it was the most marvelous piece of music I'd ever heard. I didn't even have a copy. I went and bought it, and I played it for a whole week, night and day. And I played it not night and day ever since, but I've certainly always kept it in my repertoire.
But Schubert has since not become a kind of general fare for pianists in the way that the songs have become general fare for singers. There must be perhaps some limited appeal either to performers or to their audiences.
The songs are much easier to understand. You're guided by the words, aren't you? You know. I think almost anybody can know what a Schubert song's about. I defy 99% of the pianists to know quite what the Schubert slow movement's about. It's much, much more elusive.
When you make a recital program now, of course, you could hardly be expected to put on any of what counts as modern works. But you did in your time play what was some very significant modern works. I'm thinking of that Rawsthorne Second Piano Concerto. And I wonder whether you regretted that some of the works that you did play seem to have vanished from the repertory, or at any rate you don't feel a necessity to keep them up.
Have they vanished from the repertoire? I mean, who can tell what is eventually going to be in the repertoire? In Mozart's time, his concertos weren't in the repertoire. And then in my very youngest days, when I was a child, something like the Anton Rubinstein concerto in D minor was in the repertoire of Hofmann and all the great pianists of that period. Where is it now? Who knows? The Rawsthorne number 2 may be in the coming repertoires of the outstanding pianists of the next generation. I think it's very, 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 very hard to tell. I mean, I felt that I launched it. It was, I was with the composer the whole time he was writing it. I was with him passage by passage. It was brought to me page by page, and we were very close to one another at that time. So I think I thought I knew how it went. He thought I knew how it went, and I recorded it. I played it a number of times, and so I think I launched it, and I was delighted. It was taken up then by some other pianists.
That was part of Alan Rawsthorne's Piano Concerto No. 2, Clifford Curzon with the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Sir Malcolm Sargent. Curzon's education was broad indeed, for as well as studying with Schnabel in Berlin, he studied composition in Paris with Nadia Boulanger and the harpsichord with Wanda Landowska. So Curzon knows the keyboards, not just the piano. He answers now a question about Bach.
Well, I think Bach has gone back, keyboard Bach has gone back where it belongs. I mean, to the instrument of Bach's own time. There again, I think, you see, I think the musical world is very influenced by the great players appearing at a certain time. we were all influenced because Schnabel had a particular affinity with and love for Schubert and understood it so marvelously. And I think Landowska was a wonderful player of the harpsichordist, the supreme harpsichordist of her time. And she considered the great study of her life was Bach. She used to say, I've really studied Bach, but I play Mozart as I feel him, you know. This is perfectly true. The one thing that she really knew was her Bach, and she played it, and once we heard that, you know, which we were always quoted by Schnabel, the better is the enemy of the good, and hearing Landowska play great Bach on the harpsichords, and she had many pupils also studying the harpsichord and studying Bach and so on, we had this in our ears, and we just didn't care for it so much on the piano, which is always a transcription. It doesn't have to be Bach personally, it's a transcription, whoever plays it.
You have recorded a fair amount, concertos, a number of solo works, and a few chamber works, including the Schubert Trout Quintet. And do you think that these are going to be a properly representative legacy of your style as well as your repertory?
Well, I think they must represent me at different periods. I've never been one of these people who learned to work and immediately rushed into the recording studio. I thought recordings were supposed to have something definitive about them, if possible. I know you can't have a definitive. Thank goodness you can't have a definitive performance. But they must be for you at that time definitive. And I think the only thing I can say in favor of my own recordings is that practically all of them are still in the catalogues. Whereas, and here again, I'm not going to name any other artists, most of them are withdrawn after a very short time, but mine still come up. If somebody does an Emperor, if somebody does a Brahms D minor, if somebody does a Schubert D major, up pops mine again immediately and retains its place.
Can you listen with pleasure to your own recordings?
Not really, you know, you begin to sweat. You go through it all again, you think, oh my God, yes, I was all day getting that phrase, you know, and the engineers were going mad, and then we all went home and we all got drunk or something. The next morning I went and played it straight off.
The finale to Act 1 of Strauss's The Gypsy Baron. This was our all-star cast, including Lotte Lehmann.